How are retail businesses, small businesses, going to survive COVID-19? That was the topic of my show tonight with Erin Morahan, who had to close her business, had to shutter her business in the fall of last year, and she spoke about numerous different people that she has interacted with, met, communicated with that have had similar challenges. She talked about one individual who she knew well, who she had done some consulting work for, who with a couple of locations had built up $1 million in debt, just trying to keep her businesses operational over the course of the last couple of months, just with a few locations and a business that she had put her life into, and had to close it because she just couldn't handle the continuing debt load that she was going to have to personal guarantee. And this story has happened over and over again, whether it's chains that we know of that have had to close, or whether it's independent stores that we know of that have had to close, or whether it's businesses that have had to close. I think the impact of COVID-19 on small and medium-sized businesses, and even some large businesses, is one of the costs of COVID-19 that we are somewhat aware of, but the other foot is going to drop. And I just want to, for a second, mention a couple of the well-known companies that we know that have been challenged. Lowe's and Rona have listed that they're going to expect to close 34 stores in 2020. Both close 119 locations across North America. Pier 1 Imports that they're going to close up to 450 locations. Hudson's Bay that was being sued for not paying rent in 5 different locations in Quebec and in Ontario. Lynx of London that's closing down, planning to close all 5 of its Canadian locations. Carlton Cars and Payas that are closing 78 locations in Canada and 178 in the United States. Pink Tartan that is closing down. 10,000 Villages closing down. Bench closing down. Victoria's Secret that their first quarter sales last year were down 37%, and they only closing 250 stores across North America. I could go on. And if you've gone through any of the main streets in the small towns and retail areas across the city, you've seen numerous different stores that are closed, for lease signs up, stores that have been boarded up. And if you talk to people, the impact, whether it's retail stores or restaurants or whatnot. And I'm really worried about this, not only from an economic standpoint, but from a mental health, personal standpoint. When people have put their whole life into opening a business and then have gone into debt trying to keep it alive during this time period, and have that business taken away from them because of this pandemic and the closures that the government has enforced upon them, it's tragic, and some people won't be able to deal with it. I've used this example before. If you get your business expropriated by the government because of building a road, they have to pay you fair value. Well, effectively what's happened is governments have expropriated people's businesses, albeit not forever, hopefully, for a time period. And why? It's not because they've done something wrong. It's because the government hasn't put in place the appropriate public health measures. And they should be compensating people for that loss of business. And they tried to in some ways, but it wasn't obviously enough. I think the first federal government attempt to allow landlords to get 50% of rents that they would get from the tenants payable by the federal government if they forgave 25% of the rent, and if the tenant forgave 25, and the tenant paid 25% of the rent. I've just heard too many stories of people where tenants where the landlords wouldn't play ball, and they were worried about government interference, or that they would get audited, or there'd be some check. And so I think that they've now changed it such that the money goes directly to the tenants, which is, I think, the more appropriate way. But then the landlords are out the money because there's no help on their mortgages. And then what about the people? And so, the government came through with the SERP, and wages were paid, but number one, that's not a huge amount of money. And then number two, how do you keep those people employed and working and benefiting the business when you're trying to stay operational and you're trying to keep your staff? I heard Premier Kenney from Alberta today, and it was interesting because I've not been a huge fan of his in the past, but what he talked about today was how he thought that the Alberta attitude toward closures was a far better attitude than what has been occurring in Ontario and Quebec. And what he said is he saw closures and lockdowns not as a first measure, but as the last measure. And he said the problem with closures is if you're going to do them, if you're going to have them, you've got to implement them and you've got to police them and you've got to enforce them. Because if you have the lockdowns in place too long and they're voluntary, people will lose faith and confidence in them and not follow. And people not adhering to the closures will make it potentially even worse. I'm not sure if he's right, but it's an interesting argument. Last week, I interviewed Alex Vesna, the CEO of Prepared Canada, and he argued that by closing some places and allowing other places to stay open, what we've done is we've concentrated the traffic that would occur into a smaller area and thereby, by definition, made it more congested, and that was been a mistake, and that we would have been far better off to open up everything, but limit those opening up to 20 to 30% of capacity. And, the example I used is that I go buy my meat at a local small meat store because I frankly feel safer there than in the big grocery stores. Well, wouldn't that be the same in the pharmacies? Wouldn't that be the same in the other stores? And, you think about people that have been telling me that there's lineups around Costco's and Home Depot's and liquidation centers that are allowed to stay open because they're selling a little bit of food. Wouldn't it be better to allow some of these small businesses to open up, albeit potentially with smaller capacity? And so I really think that Aaron today spoke about the hardships and the personal hardships that so many different small businesses are faced with. And I think it is a huge issue. I don't think governments have addressed it enough as of yet. I don't think governments have fought enough for our small businesses and our retail businesses and our restaurants enough. I think we can do as members of society our small part by going and buying some stuff online, going and having some takeout from the local restaurants. But in the end, I think government have got to compensate people for this public health, the impact of the public health emergency that wasn't those small and medium-sized businesses' fault. And it may be costly, but I think not doing it and having all these businesses go bankrupt, and or maybe even worse, these companies trying to struggle to stay alive with millions of dollars of debt or hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, which means they can never make a real go of it, would be potentially even worse. So I think that there's something we desperately need to do from a small business standpoint. I'd now like to tell you a little bit about some of the people that I've got on this week, if I could, because I think I've got a couple of pretty interesting people to have interviews with this week. I've got on Tuesday Amanda Cupido, who is an author of a book about podcasting, The Essential Guide to Podcasting Effectively. And it's really quite interesting because podcasting has taken off over the course of the last, I didn't realize it, but 10, 15 years. But really, I think even more so during COVID-19, when people have been desperate for information and varied information they can get electronically, and they want to listen to it via podcast. And so that's Tuesday with Amanda. On Wednesday, I've got two interesting interviews. One with a very inspirational young lady, Gracie Ella, who is a R&B singer that performs in Port Credit and has a couple of songs online that are just spectacular. She's battling addiction and depression to a certain extent because of COVID-19 and because of the impact that it's had on her ability to perform. And it's a really interesting interview about some of the challenges of everybody dealing with social isolation and lack of a job, lack of employment, lack of gigs at bars and restaurants. And then one of the most compelling interviews that I've done with a gentleman that runs an organization that compensates or tries to compensate by getting rid of debt of young girls that have been involved in human trafficking. I wasn't sure about this interview when it first started because it was going to be primarily about forgiving debt. And then he started talking about the challenges that so many victims of human trafficking are facing with debt that has been put in place by their former captors. And it's shocking what he was doing. He was telling me about the statistics in regards to human trafficking, how many young ladies how many young girls are captured. He talked about 4 different ways that they're captured. The average age that they are, which is shockingly low, how many years they actually spend in captivity, what they're forced to do in regards to prostitution and stripping and massage, and that the vast majority of the expenses are put in place in their name through their captors, through credit cards and small loans and things like this. And all that he's trying to do, which is a lot, is once they escape, getting credit card companies and phone companies and other companies willing to forgive the debts so that they can get a start in life. And, it's only a one small piece, but it's interesting because what he's doing is he's working with police agencies and other agencies to give them the typical statistics about how somebody effectively does that. And it's when a female, a young girl, and an older male who ends up being the capture goes into a phone store, gets a phone, and the guy carries the ID, or a bank, and the guy carries the ID and puts it in her name, but controls the access to the ID and a bunch of other things that allow him and the banks and computer companies to create these algorithms that will potentially protect people that have been captured in human trafficking. And the numbers of young girls that are captured in this human trafficking was shocking to me. And it's a story that needs to be heard and a problem that needs to be rectified. On Thursday, I've got another inspirational interview with Janie Brown, who is a R&B and a hip hop performer who had some challenges with trauma, wanted to get through that trauma. And the way she did was by understanding confidence and presence. And because of that, she wanted to give back. And she created a business called the Fierce Academy, which is trying to educate people how to become fiercer or confident or more stand up. They're willing to and can stand up for themselves and stand up on stage. And then Friday, I've got an interesting interview with someone who's got a website and a business called Dating After Divorce. And she talks about the challenges about dating after divorce. So that's my week this week. Hope you listen to some of my shows. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.960am.ca. Or you can get all my podcasts and video casts after the fact on briancrombie.com. Thanks. Have a good week.